All right. Today what we're going to do is we're going to dive in a little deeper into development of Android. Has anyone attempted to install it on a machine?
I did, and I failed.
Did it and it failed?
That's a problem.
I have part of it that I still have to do.
Okay. Is it on a laptop or a desktop?
Laptop.
Okay. So you have it with you?
Yes, I did.
Okay, good. We'll look at it in lab. You've added this class?
I'm auditing it.
Okay. One of the big activities last week was to get the development platform going. I don't know if you've attempted that yet or not.
No, I've been out of town on
Okay.
vacation, so I'm just returning. I'm not really prepared today.
Okay. All right.
So when you say development platform, you mean Android SDK or something?
Yeah, all that stuff. Making sure you have Java installed, making sure you have Eclipse installed. Again, the components that you need installed is you need the Java SDK, Eclipse, the Android SDK, the ADT plugin for Eclipse, and then various Android platforms. And then potentially, if you don't have a device, you need the Android virtual devices. That will allow you to test it on your machine without actually having it. I always use an Android device because otherwise it runs so slowly on this machine that I get timeout errors and things like that. So I typically do that. And there are Android devices that I have that you can use in lab. So my suggestion would be that you do this, as soon as possible. Again, configuration is a big issue. As lovely as a component-based system is, one of the issues is things have to talk to each other, and if things don't talk to each other, it's not going to work. So, a substantial amount of time is spent configuring and making sure things are set up right, and it's not necessarily trivial like it would be in other environments. That's one reason I bring my laptop in. That way, given that I don't have access to this room, except during the time that I have lectures in it, it's most convenient for me just to set stuff up on my machine at home or whenever, and then bring it in. So I'll typically be bringing in my laptop for this class, just simply so that I can make sure that everything is working right and everything's configured right before I go and run it. How many? Again, I don't recall from last time. How many of you have used an Android tablet or phone before? Okay, let's take a quick tour of what it is. Android, again, is an open source operating system. There are multiple versions associated with it. That is one, I suppose you would say, issue with it as compared to iOS, is that it runs on a lot more devices, and there's greater variation in the versions of operating system, which means that you always have potential for problems, or again, problems on a specific device. I'll see a lot of times in the Android Play Store, if I'm looking at an app, it will say it doesn't run on such and such machine, or so on, or device. There are a number of built-in applications with this. I'll just walk around and I'll show you how this works. This is a Motorola Zoom tablet. We have the screen. Everything's based on the touch screen, of course. There are a few buttons here. All right. There is this button, which is the back button, which takes you to the previous thing that you were on. One thing that we'll talk about in this class is essentially a screen where you're going to do something is called an activity. So this essentially takes you back to the previous activity. This is the home button, and it will take you to this screen. So if I'm running an application, let's say, I go on the internet and I'm web browsing. All right. If I press this button, I go back to the main screen. So these aren't physical buttons on this device, on some of them they are physical buttons. I don't have my phone with me, but on my phone they're physical buttons. But either they're physical buttons or they're buttons on the screen. So back, home. This brings up options, and it depends on the context that you're in. So for example, if I was browsing the internet and I hit options, actually that shows me a list of, I was mistaken, it does not show me options. That shows me a list of all the apps that are running. This will show me some options associated with whatever app is running, and it'll be context specific. Again, that's where some of these things are device specific. For example, for me, my button that appears here is the option button. For them, it shows up over here. One thing that you need to know is when you move away from an app, that doesn't close out of the app necessarily, which means that if you're not careful, you can have a lot of apps running and be using a lot of resources. So for example, if I were to go to the internet and I would do a search for Lorraine County Community College, bring up LC's webpage, then I go home and go and do something else, look at maps or whatever. If I go back into the home screen and open internet again, it's still up and running. So that's one thing to be aware of. And in fact, most people download just sort of an app killer that you can go and clobber all the apps that are running. You could close out of them individually, but sometimes that's a convenient way to do it. If my phone is running slow, I'll just run my app killer and kill it, as opposed to very carefully making sure I've closed out of each app correctly. One thing I would suggest that you do if you're not familiar with this, I'm not sure if our labs got set up. Well, with that, we can talk about install issues for that. Another thing to do is I can bring some of these to the lab and you can just play with them just to see the kind of things that you can do and so on with that. So that's the Android device. Again, different versions of the operating system and different kinds of device makes it a little bit more challenging of an environment in that respect than the iOS platform, because the iOS platform, again, Apple's whole thing is very tight control over everything. Therefore, there's only a handful of devices, relatively speaking. There's only a handful of platforms. That just makes the developer's life easier. They don't have to account for all these different things. I mentioned in the book there are code examples, and we'll be using those code examples quite a bit in this class. What I want to do is go over, and you can get the URL off the book. One thing I want to do, though, is talk about how to import those applications into Eclipse once you have everything up and running, and then actually running the app, and then spend some time actually looking at the pieces of an Android application. I don't remember if I kind of remember. We'll use this as a memory refresher. Based on what I recall, no one really had any Java programming experience, but we did have some C# experience. Is that correct? As a general rule? Okay. All right, so we'll also probably at some point, I don't know whether it be today or on Wednesday, go over some Java concepts and sorts of things. All right, I'm going to hit the lights, at least some of them. Is that okay, or would you prefer some light? Pardon me? That's good? All right. So, I go into Eclipse, and you get this very big, somewhat intimidating screen. To bring in a application that has already been written, that exists out there, you simply go and say, File, Import. Then you navigate to the folder that it's in. I'm picking the option existing projects into workspace. In the Eclipse environment, you have a workspace where you have stuff going on, the stuff that you're working on, and you set up that folder when you define the app. But we're going to go and we're going to pull these into our workspace. Click Next. I can then browse for it. I kind of cheated because I did this before, but here's my workspace. I put my code examples in that folder, and I can go and pick the one that I want, which is simply the Welcome Hello World application. Click Open. And Finish. And it will go through the process of importing that application. All right. Now to install it and run it, again, because of the speed of this machine, I typically run things on an actual device as opposed to an emulator. Because I'm a developer, all right, and not just your average Joe user of this, I set a couple of options on my Android device. That will allow me to install programs that don't come from Google's Play Store. All right. Again, the idea is that for most people, they'll get all their apps from the Google Play Store, much as everyone gets their apps in the iOS environment from iTunes. All right. Now with iTunes, you have to go through a process called jailbreaking to be able to install other apps that are not sort of authorized from the iTunes store. With the Android devices, there are some options that you can configure. So let's take a look at those options. On the home screen, you click this, you sort of see a list of all the programs. You go under Settings. There is a whole bunch of stuff there. Under Applications, I lied. Under Developer Options, you have a couple choices, which I turn on. One is to allow USB debugging. One is to use mock locations. That allows me to sort of do some testing. There's another option somewhere that I need to find, and that is to be able to run, so under Security. Allow installation of non-market apps. All right. What this will allow me to do with the combination of those two sets of options, the allow apps from unknown sources and these developers options, I can set this up so that it can install stuff that I've written without having to go through the Google Play Store. So you do have to do that setup first, otherwise it won't allow you to run it. So I go through my USB thingy, connect my device up to this. All right. I have imported the app into Eclipse, into the Eclipse workspace. I can now go and run it simply by right-mousing on the name of the application and say Run as Android Application. And it goes through some gyrations, all right, and it is running now on the device. So we're running on the Android device. Once you install an application, you can disconnect it, right? So it's installed on this machine. So I can go and close out of it if I want to, and I can go to my list of all applications. I can actually find that application and run it. So when you click Run, there, it actually goes and installs it on the device. So it is available on the device. So theoretically, you could go and you could install an app and disconnect it, and then you'd have it on your device, and you could go and use it going forward. So this is your basic Hello World sort of app that just displays a message and displays a couple of images. All right. We'll go in and look at the different components for this, because one of the beauties of this style of development is everything is very modularized and is done in components, which means that it's very easy to swap out components depending on the environment. Let me give you for example. For example, if we were in France, we wouldn't want the little message to say, welcome to Android app development. We'd want it to say, bienvenue, something, something, something. All right? Android probably is the same in both French and English. All right? But the point is we want different language there. And if we were in Spanish, we'd want it to say something else, and so on and so forth. All right? Now, if you think about that, how can you do that easily? Because you're going to have text and messages all over the place. We do that by having a separate component for our strings. And we put our strings in this component, in this file, in this XML file, and then you can swap out that file depending on the language that's being used. So if this was installed and the default language for the device was set to French, instead of using the English version of that file, it would use the French version of that file and pull up all the French terms for that. That's sort of very powerful, because your code then doesn't have to change. What's going to change is you're going to swap in and out these components. Or actually, I'm saying that you do it, you don't really do it. That's just a function of the operating system. Other things you can do as well is based on the size of the device. You can have different components. All right? So, this running on a phone, this particular application running on a phone looks identical on a phone and on a tablet. But we might want things to look different, right? On a tablet, we have more available space. We might want a different screen on a tablet than we do on a phone. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that we can create a component, all right, for a different size screen. Now, again, I'm just sort of laying the groundwork here. We're not going to do that in any of these examples today, but I want to sort of put that in the back of your mind. When you see all these different things and it's like, why does it take, 8 files to create this application and just simply displays that? That's one of the reasons for it. All right? Everything is separated very cleanly so that you can swap one out and swap something else in depending on circumstances, such as the language of the machine or other factors for that. All right, let's go and let's look at this in a little bit more detail. If we expand this, we'll see some of the folders that we get. All right, there's a source folder, which has actually our code in it. This is our class for our application, or rather for our activity. It's probably a better way to put it. This is a file that gets generated that contains pointers to resources. All right. Because that's generated for you, but what essentially it does is it links all the resources and stuff together. This is the Android classes that are being used in this particular example. Assets, I can put in other files that are going to be used in this, or audio clips. Binaries is where this is going to get compiled into. All right. The APK is sort of the install file. So, for example, if I wanted to email this to someone and have them install it on their Android device, I could mail them the APK, and it'd be good to go. And then finally, RES is a bunch of resources. All right. In addition, there is a project properties file and there is an Android manifest. All right, and as the class progresses, we'll see more and more stuff in those. Both these two files contain information about the application that's used in a variety of different ways. The manifest is used largely when you go to install your application on a platform. You could specify, for example, that your application works on certain versions of the operating system. You can also specify that it works on certain devices or certain size of devices. So you can make a tablet-only application if you wanted to. All right. You also specify in the Android manifest file permissions for the application. All right. If you've ever installed an application from the Android store, you'll notice that it will warn you what the application can do before you install it. All right. It will say, for example, that this application requires internet access, or this application will read and write from your memory card, or this application will turn the audio off, or whatever. There's a whole set of different things, and you specify those when you create the manifest. And if you don't put that in there, then your app can't do that. So if this application, for example, read the internet and I didn't have that permission in the manifest, then that part of the application wouldn't work. Let's look at what's in this manifest. I suspect it's going to be a pretty simple manifest. With these files, Eclipse gives you sort of two ways to look at the files. Through sort of a neat little GUI, which is this, or the actual code, which is the last one, the XML. The different tabs on the bottom prior to the XML are sort of different views, looking at different pieces of that manifest file. I am a firm believer in making sure that we understand the code. So we'll probably spend most of the time looking at the actual XML. And here's our XML. And it has different properties of this application. It says what package the application lives in, the version, and the version name. This is useful if I want to install. For example, if I were to try to install this a second time on the device, it would tell me it's already installed. All right, and it wouldn't bother reinstalling it. But if I bumped up the version number, then it would install over it because it assumes that it's a fix. All right. This says what's the minimum SDK, what's the minimum version of Android that this application will run under. In this case, it is 9. We then have associated with the application, the icon, the name, the label, the name of the application, and intent filters, which sort of are what happens when this activity is fired up. Again, this being a very simple application, there's not a lot in the manifest file, but the manifest file goes with the APK, and it goes with the code that's being installed to let the user know when they're installing it, like what they're getting. All right, just like a shipping manifest shows you what's being shipped, this shows you, hey, this is what you're getting, and these are the things it requires, and so on. So we'll look at this throughout the semester as we add more and more stuff to our applications.
Does it automatically populate the information in there from the other screens as you type in and select the criteria?
Yeah. In other words, like this.
Yeah.
This is simply a neater view of that XML file. So if I went in and changed something here,
And then what you enter, if you went and changed it in the XML, would also show that in the next.
exactly, yeah, exactly. It's just different windows. It's similar in Visual Studio if you've seen it to the design view versus the code view. The code view lets you like get into the nuts and bolts of it. The design view is kind of a neater way to look at it. So yeah, those are just different views sort of into it formatted. How familiar would you say you are with XML collectively? If I had to ask you on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being that you wrote the specification, 1 being that you're not sure how to spell XML, where would you put yourself? 1 to 10.
I'm probably at 2 or 3.
2 or 3? All right.
I can spell it.
You can spell it? Excellent. Everyone about in the same boat?
Yeah.
Okay. XML is used a lot in Android development, so you will become a little more familiar with it. XML is simply XML itself isn't a language. It's sort of a meta language. It's a language that you use to define other languages. So XML is sort of a specification that says what is a legal, format and what isn't. XML uses tags. And if you've done any HTML coding, you're familiar with tags, right? The tags indicate what these different sections mean, what these different pieces mean. With an XML file, there is at the top a declaration that says what the specification is, what version of XML that's being used, and so on. So that's not really a tag, that's a declaration. You notice then the tags sort of look like HTML tags. All right, but they're not HTML code, they're code for describing an Android manifest. We're using those sets of rules. And in this case, every XML file has to have a root node. All right. Oftentimes these are described as tree structures, right? Because you have a root, and then coming from the root you can have offshoots, and coming from the offshoots you can have more offshoots, and so on going down. Oftentimes they use the analogy of a tree structure. All right. Really no different than, like, say, a directory structure on a hard drive, right? On a directory of a hard drive, you have the root directory. Underneath that, you can have other subdirectories. Underneath that, you can have that. So the same sort of tree. And for the manifest file, the root node is going to be a manifest tag. That manifest tag can contain other tags. This says what the minimum SDK version is. This says information about the application and activity and intents. Notice that there's nesting, there's containment. So for example, the activity information is part of the application information. Likewise, the action is part of the intent, all right, which is part of the activity, which is part of the application, which is part of the manifest. All tags in XML come in pairs. They have to come in pairs, with one tiny little exception, all right? And that is a tag that looks like this, that instead of having a greater than sign here, it has a slash greater than sign. This is a starting and ending tag rolled into one. So that's what that particular syntax means. So it still has a starting and ending tag, it's just that the one line serves both purposes. It's both the starting and ending tag. It's called an empty tag. When there's nothing in between the start and end, that's what you do. And again, remember that doesn't count because that's a declaration. All right? Now, one thing about this is for every XML file, there's rules about what tags you can have. All right? In other words, when they defined an Android manifest, they said, hey, the Android manifest can have a uses SDK tag and can have an application tag And the application tag can contain activities and so on and so